and welcome. My name is Clayton Bridges. Today we're going to be talking about brake jobs. A brake job is a simple service that most people are going to have to do in their lifetimes. Almost all cars are going to need brakes at some point. Generally, when we say brake job, what does that mean? A brake job would be either replacing or resurfacing the brake rotors or the drum itself if you have a drum brake system, and then replacing the brake pad linings. In the case of a disc brake, it would be the disc brake pad, brake pad, pads, brake lining, right? I don't have an example of drum brakes, and I'm probably not going to talk about them again because I won't be going over drum brakes in this video. So a brake job is very important because it is what stops your vehicle. It's a very serious safety deal. If it is that important, how exactly do you know when it's time to do a brake job? Well, there's a few things to look out for. The number one thing is going to be noise. Now, there's kind of two types of noise that are generally concerning. One would be like a loud metallic scraping noise that would be known as a squeal, and it just sounds like a loud high-pitched squeal, very annoying, happens under braking. So when you go to brake and you hear, then you might know it is time to do a brake job, or at least inspect them and make sure nothing's going wrong. Now, you can get a high-pitched squealing noise from your brakes even if you don't have squealers. So taking a look at this brake pad, we have this piece of metal. So you see how this piece of metal sticks up higher than the backing plate? Well, when this brake material wears down to the point where this is physically touching the rotor, it'll make a squealing noise, and that is literally meant to indicate to you, the driver, it's time to look at your brakes. Take a look at the surface of this brake pad. It's rather porous, right? And we also have this big vein in the middle that's meant to help gases escape, dust, and other particulates, including gravel. Sometimes little rocks will even make their way into this little vent, this little slot. Things can get trapped in here and dragged across a metal surface. It will also make a squealing noise. So sometimes the squealing noise is really about the pads being dirty. In this case, when you're looking at noise, the only true way to prove if it's actually worn down to the point where the squealer's on it or whatever is to get a physical look at it. You can either get a wheel off or even see through the wheel the amount of pad lining you have left, and if it looks like a good amount, then maybe you can get away with cleaning the rotor or something like that. However, in most cases, that's not going to be the case, and it's really just not the best way to deal with it. In addition to noises, you might also be experiencing brake pulsation. Essentially what happens here is the surface of the rotor that the brake pads are clamping down on is uneven, and as you press down on it, the feedback from that rotor, being of different sizes, is going to be pushing that hydraulic fluid back through the pedal into your foot. When you go and put your foot down on the brakes and you start to feel a vibration only while braking, then generally you have a problem with the brake rotor. So technically this is when a brake rotor goes out of parallel, meaning if you measured across different parts of the brake rotor surface, the actual thickness, there will be a variation in thickness across the rotor. There is a specification for it, and if you want to go that far, you can look it up. However, chances are if your brakes are pulsating, you're going to need new rotors. Now, a lot of people are going to be aware that you can resurface or machine rotors. That is an option in some cases, however, it's hard for me to recommend it. Places like O'Reilly's, Advanced, maybe even AutoZone, sometimes will be able to resurface rotors for you, and if you take them in, they can cut them for you. That's going to require an extra trip that you might not be able to make if your car is under construction. Additionally, you're still using the same metal. There are theories out there that if you have thickness variation in brakes, or they're out of parallel or whatever, and you get them machined and then you go and get the brake rotor hot, it's just going to go right back to its memory and possibly pulsate again. In my opinion, rotors are simply cheap enough and the easier way to do it. I'm just going to throw rotors on almost every brake job. Just do the rotor and pads. It's just the easier way about it. That being said, there are some reasons where you shouldn't reuse a rotor. If it has deep pitting due to rust, if it's excessively rusty, if it's deeply gouged on the surface of the rotor from debris and whatever, or of course if it's out of spec. It's also possible for the brake rotor to be so worn that it can't even be cut, it doesn't have any more material. Additionally, hot spots, any blue or discoloration on the surface. Most of us know what really hot metal looks like, right? Gets all blue and purpley. In addition to pulsation, there's one last reason you might do a brake job, and that's your dash light. Some cars actually have sensors on the brake pads that do indicate that the brake pad is worn to the point where you need to replace them. It just has a little sensor, and when it gets broken, as in it rubs against the rotor and goes away, then it just affects the circuit and the dash light comes on. You know you're gonna need to replace the sensor because it's been broken. That can be an additional cost. Generally, they're not too expensive. So let's talk about getting parts. A lot of different places have brake job packages that come with just about everything you need to do a full brake job. Parts stores will sell the pads in a set. You will have to buy rotors individually, meaning if you buy a front brake job, for example, you will need 2 rotors, 1 brake pad set. The brake pad set should come with a little bag of hardware and maybe even some grease. If you get your little brake pad box and it doesn't come with a baggie full of hardware, you should probably march right back and get it. Otherwise, you'll have to reuse the old hardware, which isn't always ideal. These kits come with little brackets or shims that hold the pad in place on the bracket itself. On some systems, they'll come with little tiny return springs that pull the pads off the rotor so they don't drag. And they'll also come with little squealers. A lot of the times they're not already attached to the pad, so look out for those and make sure you get them on before you install the pads. Some other things you're going to need would be brake cleaner. This helps clean new rotor surfaces and clean the surfaces when you're done, just to make sure there's no fingerprints, grease smudges, etc. And you have a nice clean rotor that's not going to contaminate the brake pads. Brake fluid to replenish the fluid that will either be lost or taken out of the reservoir. We'll talk about that in a minute. Brake caliper grease. There are so many different types of brake grease, and this is a huge point of debate for a lot of mechanics. Some say use something copper-based, some say use this stuff, some say use this purple stuff. To be honest with you, as long as the grease is designed to handle the heat and is specifically made for brake applications, then I think you are more than fine. A lot of the time you will even get grease that comes with the brake pads, and I'd say that's okay to use as well. As long as you're applying it in the correct places, as long as it can handle the heat, I just don't see a whole lot of difference. I have had so many different people swear by different materials, and they were all decent mechanics, and you know what? None of them commonly got brake job comebacks. Keep in mind, a lot of stock brake pads don't come pre-lubed from the factory. So as far as suggested tools, there are a few things in my opinion that are a must-have, and the rest are kind of up to you. First of all, I highly suggest something to remove brake fluid out of the master cylinder reservoir. A little midi vac sucker like this. They have big syringes, a small syringe, a turkey baster even, anything that can just simply suck some fluid out of that reservoir. Keep in mind brake fluid's nasty and you don't want to suck it into any device that's gonna get destroyed by it. You do want to remove a little of the brake fluid. We'll go over that in a second. You also might not have to, so this isn't necessarily completely mandatory, but it's a nice thing to have just in case. The other thing, in my opinion, that's going to be absolutely necessary is a torque wrench. Not so much for the brake caliper components. When you put your wheels back on, you're going to want to torque the lug nuts to spec. That's just the correct way to do it. You really should have a nicely calibrated torque wrench if you're going to be working on your own car. Have to highly suggest that. The other most important tool is going to be something to retract the pistons on the brake caliper. You have several options here, and I'm going to go over a couple. So for front brakes, you simply have a piston in the caliper that needs to get pushed back in. So you can accomplish that in a couple of ways. By far my favorite tool to use is this guy right here. Looks like a little TIE fighter. So essentially this just slips between the caliper itself and the piston, and then when it ratchets, it expands and it just pushes the piston back into the caliper. This does a really great job at applying even pressure, and it works just like a dream. Additionally, you can just use a pry bar, and once the caliper is still on the rotor, then generally you can stick this in, use this to pry on the pad, and use the pad to apply the pressure to push the pistons in. Additionally, a big set of slip joint pliers like this really does great. This thing has a ton of leverage. It simply has the power to squeeze in a piston. I mean, generally this is kind of the old school way of doing it. Sometimes this is just really the quick and dirty way to get in there and just squeeze the hell out of it. For an at-home kind of person, this is the tool that you're probably most likely to have as well. Now, the other tools to actually remove the bolts and whatnot are going to vary. On a lot of Japanese cars, it's almost always a 14 and 17. GM stuff will utilize 13s. A lot of American vehicles use odd-numbered metrics. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you to find the proper size. I do suggest a tool that is long with a lot of leverage. There's going to be bracket bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle, and those are going to be tight. They're going to be hard to break off, and they're going to be hard to tighten up properly. For example, we have this ratchet, which is a decent snap-on knockoff from Harbor Freight. It has a lot of leverage, as you can see, as well as a flex head, a nice tooth count. For the larger caliper bracket bolts, I might even suggest a breaker bar or a large half-inch drive ratchet. Again, they are going to be needing to be tight. Some of them are over 100 foot-pounds of torque. So without further ado, let's get this hood open and get started. If you are using the method where you are simply going to push the piston back without opening the bleeder, and we'll talk about the difference in a minute, then you are going to want to take your cap off, stick your little sucky device in there, and pull out most of the fluid in this reservoir. Do not suck it dry. I wouldn't even suck it past like the last quarter of it, because then you will have a huge problem. And while we're in here, we want to take note of the condition of the fluid. So generally with brake fluid, the darker green it is, the worse condition it's in. So through the reservoir, this looks pretty dirty. We want to look at the fluid itself, unbiased by the color of the reservoir, right? So one really important thing about brake fluid is the fact that it's hygroscopic, which means it absorbs moisture from the air and absorbs moisture in general. There are testers where you can test the water content of brake fluid, and once it hits a certain point, it is no good. Another good thing to keep in mind is you want to keep your brake fluids capped. Anytime you can use like a new bottle, it's ideal. Plastic's permeable. Who knows how much water this could have absorbed over the past year. It's sat in our garage. So if you can suck almost all of the fluid out of the reservoir and then refill it without going dry, of course, is really important, then it's not a bad idea just to keep new fluid in there. Next thing we need to talk about with brake fluid are the types of brake fluid. There's .3, .4, and .5. .5 is really uncommon. It's silicone based. It's not hygroscopic. Generally it's only used on kind of niche vehicles. I think a lot of European cars occasionally use it. .5 is not a commonly used thing, and again, it is silicone based, and anything that you use .5 in has to be a .5 system. We also have .3 and .4. The difference between .3 and .4 is simply the boiling point. The boiling point of .4 is higher, which means if you use .3 fluid in a .4 system, you may actually encounter brake fluid starting to boil in the lines, and guess what? That's going to cause some serious issues. So when people say they're not compatible, really what they don't want you to do is use .3 in a .4 system. However, if you use .4 in a .3 system to gain that higher boiling point, for example, on my Miata, it recommends .3, but I take the car autocrossing, where I'm braking extremely hard and doing all that kind of stuff, so I want to run that higher boiling point. And in my opinion, you might as well always run .4. That's just me. Make sure you're using the right fluid. You can almost never go wrong with using the recommended fluid for the vehicle. So once you have replaced this fluid, or at least taken a little bit out so that when you compress the pistons, it's not going to squirt out the top here, which is the whole reason we take fluid out of the reservoir, by the way. Because when we retract those pistons are going to push the hydraulic fluid back through the system, and it can actually overflow out of the reservoir and drip onto some other stuff. We really, really don't want brake fluid to drip onto other stuff, because brake fluid is extremely damaging to paint. Alrighty, so I'm going to begin by lifting the vehicle up. Of course, I'm going to loosen my lug nuts first, so I don't have to do that in the air. I'm going to lift it from the subframe so we can get both wheels up off the ground at the same time. It is now safely placed on jack stands. It's not going anywhere. Try and push it off. I'm going to point out right away, they're very, very shiny, pretty glazed. You want to take a little sample of how thick this lip here is. Might give you a good idea of how much the rotor's actually worn. Spin it, see if it's making any noise. This pad actually is decently low, a little lower than I thought it would be. Looking at the back of the caliper, we have this smaller bolt that holds the actual caliper onto the bracket, and then this right here is the caliper bracket bolt itself. You can kind of see down there, there's a bracket bolt, and then a caliper bolt. These bolts will usually be a lot smaller, and there should be 4 total. So generally, if you have like a high leverage wrench like this, what makes it difficult is finding space for it. Oh, those are really tight. Wow. Once the wrench loosens them, I like to use my electric ratchet. Makes life a lot easier. So with those 2 bolts on the bracket removed, I can now go ahead and pull off the caliper. When you have a caliper off, it needs to be held up or supported by something, because you have this brake line here, and if you just let this dangle by the brake line, it's going to damage it, okay? Never do that. It's often there's these holes, and you can string a wire through and hang it off a coil or a control arm or whatever, or sometimes even just resting on top of it like this works. Now this is a really good time to take note of where everything is, between the squealer, how the brackets are set up, how these return springs are organized, all sorts of that stuff. So please take note of that, and it'll help you on reassembly. This does have brake wear sensors. If your vehicle also has that, be aware of those. Don't damage them. And you will have to take these out of their little brackets in order to be free. Just gonna go ahead and pull them out of the bracket for now. I'm gonna remove these springs, pull this pad straight out. Okay. Looks pretty terrible. Sometimes sticking a little pry bar helps. Okay, make sure we're not damaging it. Okay, hopefully our new pads have the sensor. Unfortunately, it does not have that. Always a good idea to do a side-by-side comparison of your different components to make sure that dimensionally they're going to be correct, and also so that you can know that you have been screwed out of your sensor. In this particular case, I have to remove these brackets that that hold the wiring for the sensor. Alright, the top one. It's like all my weight. Oh, sometimes different angle works pretty well. Alrighty. At this point, with these two bolts off, our bracket's coming off. Sometimes it's not a bad idea to look at the bolt, see if there's any sort of thread locker or anything on it. It's good to take note of that. And off comes the bracket. It's primarily Japanese models that use this, but as you can see we have little screws, Phillips head screws, that are here. Ideally what you want is a manual impact driver. I don't think I have mine at home right now, so I'm gonna try a regular screwdriver and hopefully not mess it up. So I actually have my vessel screwdriver Impacta, which is technically supposed to be an impact wrench. Once I hit it on the back of this, it should twist. That worked. I felt it. I felt it push. So really just got to hit it harder. So press. Really hit that thing. Wow, look at that. It works really well. So with those out, our rotor's free. This is as deep as we're gonna go, and our next step is gonna be cleaning this hub, and then we're gonna just start going the other direction, putting things back on. Something a little like this is pretty ideal. You can probably use a variety of different things. You could even just use sandpaper, but just go. I'm literally gonna do this with a drill. But just do your best to clean up this rusty surface. Pretty much all brake discs come with a anti-corrosion coating. You're going to want to use brake clean to clean off the surface of the rotor there and get all that stuff off, because it will not be good if you leave it on. Alrighty. So, get the rotor hanging back on. Obviously, if you have screws, in some cases you'll need to make sure that those are aligned properly. Looks like I don't think we can mess this one up. There we go. And I'm just going to reuse the screws. And this is kind of a nice design because it helps you, just helps seat the rotor. Next is cleaning the bracket. A couple things we need to do here. So first of all, remove the hardware. So I like to go ahead and clean it. Just needs a wire brush. Clean anywhere that hardware touches. I like to get them pretty clean. Do this in a well-vented area. It's going to be a lot of brake dust. Wear a mask is even ideal. Alright, so once that's clean, I'm going to go ahead and spray it down with brake clean. You can even use water. Water is plenty effective for washing brakes. So this next part is the most important part of cleaning the caliper bracket. So on floating caliper designs, you'll have these pins. I suggest doing them one at a time. Go ahead and just clean the pin, clean all this grease. Use brake clean if it suits you. Get that nice and clean, because this is what the entire caliper slides on. You want it really nice. And this is going to be the first thing we use brake grease on. Okay? So just give it a pretty liberal coating. Something like that. And pop her back in. And that should feel nice and slidey compared to this. Ooh, that is very not moving. Okay. I like to spin it around and twist it in as it goes in to spread it. It's time to put the hardware back on. Ideally, get a good idea of where it was before you ever take it off. That way you can just plop it right back in. So when in doubt, think of the orientation of the bracket as well as how the pad's going to go in. The next step is putting the bracket back on. Some people say that you can use a little bit of Loctite, a very tiny amount, on the bracket bolts, just in case. A lot of people like to do that. A lot of people really dislike to do that. Some people say, hey, you know, anything that's going to be taken apart again by a mechanic probably shouldn't be used with red Loctite or whatever, but however, on the flip side, you also never want a bracket coming loose on a customer or yourself. I don't mind using just a smidge. Okay, position your bracket back up. Okay. So, just do your best to make sure these are very tight. If you really like, you can torque them. I like to give this a spin to make sure none of our hardware is rubbing already. If your rotor doesn't have these screws, it might not be flush with the hub. Okay, now debatably the most important part. According to this, you should be coating all metal on metal surfaces with grease. So what I like to do is I like to just, once the bracket's on, get a little bit in here. Don't use too much. Too much is a very bad thing. It can get on the rotor. Also, don't get any on the rotor. Without getting any grease on the pads, go ahead and get this in place and ready to get pushed in. Something that's important to note is where the squealers are. You want the squealers to be like the first thing that the rotor touches, which I think is a really weird rule, because to me it doesn't make sense if it matters too much. However, I'm going to position these facing down. That way when the rotor is coming this way, that's what it'll be hitting. The inside pad's always a pain in the ass. When you push this piston back in and you go to retract this caliper, it's going to force that amount of fluid back through the system and eventually through the master cylinder. When we're retracting this, we have two options. Number one, take fluid out of the reservoir. That way when we push that fluid back up, it won't come back out, spilling everywhere and possibly damaging paint. Or we can crack the bleeder on the back. That way while we push, then all the fluid will be forced out of the caliper right here and it won't be pushing anywhere else. Now technically that is the best way to do it, and that's the way I'm going to show you today. It does get a little scary because if you break a bleeder or if the bleeder's clogged, you could run into a lot of potential problems. And it's kind of a mess. I have our handy dandy little thing right here, and that's the way we're going to do it. So, I am going to use this penetrating lubricant. Obviously, if you're going to be spraying this, watch where it ends up. Don't get this on the brakes. As for your wrench, it is ideal to use a 6-point closed-end wrench, okay? If really necessary, you can also crack it loose using just a traditional ratchet. And that is what we did. Just crack it to the point where it's not even letting go yet. Uh-oh, don't get brake fluid on anything. Really not a good idea to do it directly above the brake job. So now that that's cracked, that's going to do two things for us. First of all, it's going to make retracting these calipers a lot easier. It's just going to be the proper way to do it and give us peace of mind about not shoving disgusting fluid where it shouldn't be. So as you can see, it's pushing out of the caliper. And it's quite a lot of fluid, you know. So now with that done, you can just go ahead and tighten it back up. Okay, get our cover back on. And there we have one retracted caliper. You can even do something in the fashion of taking the old pad, putting it there, and then using your pliers like that and squashing it in. You can also have this here and use a pry bar to do the same, or pry against whatever you find fit. That little tool is definitely the best way to do it. I'm going to clean the contact areas on the piston itself, which means both the piston surfaces as well as this piece on the bracket. Just using brake clean to wipe it down, get all the junk out of there. At this point, it's time to lube the pads, and you have two choices. You can lube the backing plate of the pad itself or the caliper itself. I usually go for the backing plate of the pad. And it's a good idea to maybe even match it up and see kind of where your caliper is going to line up, you know. On this one, I'm just going to coat pretty much the whole backing plate because it looks like it's going to make contact with the whole thing. Again, do not use too much because it will end up in places you don't want. Then over here, I'm actually going to do it directly on the piston. And do a light coat, okay? But before we put our caliper on, what are we forgetting? Return springs. So this is going to make things a little bit of a pain in the butt because it does push the pads out a little bit. There we go. So with those in place, making sure that our brake line isn't twisted or bound up, now we're ready to slide this bad boy on. And if you compressed it enough, it should be no problem. And there she is. It's time for our next little smaller pieces of hardware. What I like to do is spin the rotor just to make sure it's not making contact with anything weird. It's okay for it to make a little bit of noise when it's touching the pad material, but just any kind of metallic noise or anything like that. And then when I'm all done, I like to just give the rotor one more spray and make sure any contaminants that might have gotten on it are gone. Generally speaking, the second side goes a lot faster. Pretty low on that one. And this is the side that's making more noise, so makes sense. Obviously, the downside of having screws, especially Phillips heads, is when people don't know what they're doing. This one was stripped when I got in there, so I just spent the past half an hour removing it. The bottom one's just flat out snapped off, so time for the wheel. With the vehicle and the full weight on the ground, it's very important to torque the wheels to spec. So, especially on a brake job, when we're talking about the 5 lugs, we're putting pressure through the wheel directly on the rotor. Okay, and so we don't really want uneven pressure. We want to make sure we do our sequence. Now, generally it's a good idea to retorque after like 100 miles or after a small test drive, but that's a good thing to know. The really important part that we don't really want to miss, just in case someone comes behind us when we're backing up, we want to get in the car and go ahead and press that brake pedal several times until you get a hard pedal. It also helps seat those pads and get the fluid back in those pistons. That's done and you've pressed the pedal. Now we can make sure our brake fluid level is okay. The last step is going to be the test drive. Now the test drive is rather important because you can do some things wrong and there's some things that you should do right. So first of all, when you're breaking brakes in, it's really not a good idea to go hard on them at all. We'll even tell customers as they're leaving the shop, obviously if you need to in an emergency, use your full stopping power. Do go easy on them. Pads have to kind of meet with the surface of the rotor, start start getting the groove of it. Now, there is a break-in procedure where it wants you to start off with like maybe a 10 mile an hour, slow down to 5 mile an hour, go up to 20, whatever, and they have their own little kind of thing. If you just do a very casual drive around the neighborhood, no sudden stops, and you're not hard on them, and you just do a normal like 10 mile an hour to 5 mile an hour stop or whatever, start off very slow, low speeds, get them going, and then you can bring it up and then start seating them at a little higher speed. Another note, sometimes when you're done with a brake job and you come back, there will be actually literal smoke coming from the wheels, and you can probably smell some stuff. For the most part, that's normal. If it's like super excessive, check it. I like to look at the surface of the rotors to make sure I'm not seeing anything that's being dragged across it, like a piece of metal, a backing plate, whatever. So I want to make sure that it looks good and it's not like discolored or anything. Okay, I'm at the end of my alley, and this reminded me of something. So if you have like walls or something like this next to you that will help bounce sound, it's not a bad idea to drive past some of those just to make sure you're not hearing anything. Annoyingly, I actually do have a sound. I'm gonna try and see if you can hear it. Probably just gonna bring it back, pull the wheel off, and check on it. Based on the sound, I think the rotor might be rubbing on the backing plate a little bit. Well, it happens on the left side when I turn right, so stupid. Alright, after I took the car back to the garage, I took the wheel off and I inspected everything, and I believe what happened was my backing plate might have been a little close. I don't know, but I took the wheel off. Basically, it went away eventually. Sometimes brake rotors can be a little noisy when they're braking in. Additionally, the backing plate can be a really common problem. Sometimes when you're working on a brake job, you might bend that backing plate a little bit, and what'll happen is it'll rub on the rotor and give you a little panic attack. Alright, so in this video, everything we did should cover about 90% of brake jobs on most cars today. There are some other types of brakes, of course. There are drum brakes and there are parking brakes, which we haven't talked about. But the vast majority of brake jobs on modern vehicles will be just like the ones that we did today. Now, there are two other types of calipers that we didn't really cover. What we worked on today is called a floating caliper design, which utilizes the slide pins. There is also a fixed caliper, which is very similar, except the caliper itself doesn't move, hence fixed, and it does not have slide pins that it slides on. So it just stays where it is, and then you can remove the pads out of the back of the caliper, and removing it is pretty much the same. It's just 2 bolts that you undo. Those are really not super common. Toyota actually uses them on some of their larger vehicles like 4Runners, and some higher end vehicles use fixed calipers, but most average cars you're not going to see these. The other type is a weird type that's kind of technically a sliding caliper, very similar to a full floating. Really only a few GM vehicles use these, and they're pretty much the same, except instead of pins, it kind of slides in a different way, but they're pretty straightforward. Now on the rear brakes, you're going to encounter a parking brake mechanism. This kind of complicates things for rear disc brake jobs often. There's really 3 main types of parking brake setups on rear disc brakes. The simplest type utilizes a drum brake in the middle of the top hat of the rotor. So when you pull the parking brake lever, the cable expands those drum shoes and stops the wheel from rotating. On those types, sometimes you'll have a little port, a little hole in the top hat of the rotor that has a little dust cover. You remove the dust cover, and then on the bottom of the assembly, there's a little star adjuster that you can back off, which will bring in the drum brakes a little bit so that you can get the rotor off. Sometimes you can just pull the rotor off without having to adjust it at all, but a lot of times there's a little lip that forms around the drum on the inside of the rotor that prevents you from pulling it off and can be quite the pain. Now, there's also a type that utilizes the actual caliper itself and has a mechanical lever that gets pulled that activates the piston. So there's 2 types of these calipers that I've seen. One, there is a little dust cover on the back that you remove, and there's a little adjuster set screw where you stick an Allen wrench through the back of the caliper into that little adjuster, and then you use that to back off the piston, and then you can pull the caliper off. I've really only seen those on my Miata, and I'm sure other manufacturers might use those. There's an additional type that's very important where the piston itself has a groove in it, and you will actually need a special tool to fit in that groove, and then you actually twist the piston and thread the caliper in to back it off. So when it comes to rear parking brakes, it's really important to know what you're working with. The drum brake inside of the top hat is really common and relatively easy to deal with, although sometimes it makes the rotor coming off a pain in the ass. The other types are really important because if you use any of the methods that we did to retract that caliper, and you go in and you smush on that caliper, you can really damage it. So you have to be really careful and make sure you're retracting the piston the correct way in those rear parking brake calipers. There's a couple types of calipers, and then we also have the rear parking brake, but other than that, this is how to do a brake job on like 90% of applications. Drum brakes are a whole different ball game, but drum brakes aren't super common anymore. This has been a little bit of a masterclass on doing some brakes. These are all tips and tricks that I've learned from doing brake jobs professionally at shops as an apprentice technician, and I've really learned how to do brake jobs from like probably 10 different technicians, and you know, they all vary, but generally speaking, this is how pretty much all professionals do it, and this is how to do a really high quality, nice brake job. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot. I hope this was at least entertaining. I know it was a long one. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like if you enjoyed the video, leave a comment if you have anything to say, and don't forget to subscribe for more. We're going to be making a bunch of car content. I'll see you later.